Cushing's Bookshelf, Episode 13, an update episode on the new annotated Frankenstein, of course, by Mary Shelley. And I am Nicole Cushing. This is my bookshelf, hence the title, Cushing's Bookshelf. And I'm taking this book off the shelf again. This is an annotated version of Frankenstein by, of course, Mary Shelley, and edited and with a foreword and notes by Leslie S. Klinger. And I had talked about this maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago because I wanted to talk about just how well researched the foreword was and how I learned a lot about Mary Shelley from that. But I wanted to revisit it because I'm now about halfway through the book itself, and I wanted to give you some feedback on the novel. And so a couple of things occur to me. One is that in some ways this reminds me of another book I did recently on the bookshelf, talking about A Season in Hell by Arthur Rimbaud. And because he was 19 when this was written, Mary Shelley was 19 when this was written. And both of them, to me, show signs of youthful inexperience, which is not to condemn them at all. But both of them have a kind of herky-jerky quality to them. And especially with Mary Shelley working in the context of the novel, its pacing seems, especially at the beginning, really uneven. And I could be reading too much into this, but it almost is like she's not really confident at the start. But she gets much more so later on. And the story becomes much more solid, I think, later on. Although it still has some issues. And I think the novel form is honestly a little bit more forgiving of herky-jerkiness and instability because it's so long that you can kind of mess up in some places and it doesn't show quite so much. Whereas Rimbaud, when he's writing poetry is so short that you have less room for error, I think. So that's one thing that kind of, impresses me is that both of these folks, were there in Europe, and they were both very young, and they both had experiences of some tragedy, both in the 19th century, although Rimbaud apparently later. And they both took to the written word like this, which, if you think about it, I wish that more 19-year-olds would be producing works like this and everything. But yeah, anyway, so that's the first thing. It's just the parallels to Rimbaud in some ways. The other things that kind of come to mind are, I wanted to talk about some of the themes in the book that occur to me. The big one that I see is the theme of guilt. Guilt is all throughout the pages of this book. You have Victor Frankenstein's guilt at having created what he perceives as a monster. You have guilt in terms of somebody. There's a character named Justine in the book who is given the burden of a death sentence for a crime she did not commit. And she has had a confession coerced from her by a member of the clergy. So you have that whole dynamic. You just have like a sense of guilt throughout the whole book, really, and along with a feeling of grief and grief and guilt being oftentimes commingling in this book. And then the other thing I just wanted to talk about is, the sense of, the idea of who can you trust? The monster or the creature, however you choose to describe it, has been abandoned by his creator. And so the one entity that creature would depend on for some kind of guidance is given no guidance and is abandoned. And so that's where the creature's anger comes from, right? So you have that aspect, but also just in general, the creature goes out and is attacked by a mob for no other reason than his appearance. And yeah, who can you trust? And also you have the miscarriages of justice, the institutions that should be helpful in terms of the clergy and the courts, etc. A sense of order that should be there is actually compromised. And so there's a sense of disorder or of institutions failing. And even the educational institution that Victor Frankenstein is involved with at Ingolstadt, I think it is. It's ideally they would offer some guidance and they would know what's going on under his studies, but they don't. And so I think time and again you have a question of people who are supposed to be trustworthy turn out not to always be trustworthy. And so you have this another theme of alienation emerge. And so the question then becomes alienation hurts, but it's better than being around people and trusting them. So there's some deep stuff going on here. I've talked about this way too long, but it's important to talk about. So anyway, for this week, a revisit of Frankenstein, and who knows, next week I may be finished with it, and I may offer another take of what it's like after I've completed it all. So anyway, that's all I got. Take care, y'all.